Good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday, and welcome to another episode here on I've Got 10. And we are going to continue our podcast series with the amazing team from the Dental Consultant Connection. And this morning's guest, I'm very, very excited and honored to have Dr. Roy Shelburne on the podcast. Good morning, Roy.
Morning, John. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. And I have to say, when I was putting in the title for the stream, how to stay out of prison, very intriguing. And I know you have a very interesting story. And I will just tell everybody this morning, Dr. Roy is we're going to, 10 to 15 minutes. We're going to kind of high level some tips on his experience, what he teaches about. We are then going to move on to our audio podcast. We'll get into more detail, and he can, share even more in depth about what he does, his story, and things like that. So, but love to have you get started and talk a little bit about your experience. And I think more importantly, like we said, documentation and billing and all that great stuff that you teach people about.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. The story's a little unique. Dentist practicing in the western part of Virginia for about 27 years, had flown to California to the American Dental Association meeting, was sitting in Giuliani's keynote speech that year, and my phone began to vibrate. Hoping it was my wife, I waited for Giuliani to finish. I called her back and I asked her what was up, and I found out that the FBI had come to my office. They were battering down my back door and taking all my records. The title that I gave you, although it may sound a little bit impossible, it's very possible. I'm the guy that went to prison for ignorance, for things that I didn't know. So I share my story about what I learned in the process, and I hope to be the last dental professional that goes to prison for ignorance, for things that they didn't know. So that's what I'll be sharing. That's what I focus on. I want to make sure that people understand that there are risks involved in doing dentistry. We, as dentists, like to focus on the clinical part, with the time with our patients, and not so much on the business part. But it's very important that we focus on both. Otherwise, we might find ourselves in harm's way. So that's what I do. That's what I focus on. I speak, write, and consult. I speak on the subject. I'm American Dental Association because I want to be the last professional that goes to prison because of ignorance.
Yeah, excellent. And so when you're talking about things like that, and we'll get into a little bit in detail here.
Sure.
Who is at risk, right? I mean, certainly, I think that's a great place to start when you're
Sure.
framing out everybody in the practice and thinking about that. So share a little bit about that.
Sure. Ultimately, it's the doctor responsible. The doctor is the person whose name is on the claim form, the person who is responsible for setting up systems in the practice to make sure that everything's being done properly. But it's not just the doctor. Team members can be involved as well. There have been actions where, for example, oral surgeon in Texas was indicted for healthcare fraud. His business manager was indicted, as well as his lead assistant. And he didn't have a practice of his own. He rotated through 6 different practices in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, using their space, renting their space. Also indicted those 6 doctors. So ultimately, is the whole team liable? Absolutely. In this particular case, the 2 team members, they removed the indictment against them in exchange for, wait for it, their testimony against their doctor. The 6 doctors who provided space for this doctor to practice, they dropped the indictment against them, but it was weeks before it went to trial, and I understand that they spent a massive amount of money in preparation for it. So everybody is ultimately liable for what happens in the practice, the billing, the coding, and the documentation. Nobody's off the hook. Everybody's responsible. So therefore, everybody should be interested in putting together a system where all individuals know what's their responsibility and how to meet that responsibility to make sure that you're protected.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked about something, a key word, documentation. And I know, as I've heard and talked with people in the industry that have listened to you speak and coach and all the things that you do, I know documentation is a big thing. So talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Your clinical record is a legal document that establishes exactly what was done. So if it's not in your clinical record, it wasn't seen, it wasn't said, it wasn't done, it didn't need to be done, it doesn't exist from a legal perspective. That document, unless it is captured and the reasonable expectation is that that document does provide a complete story, the patient's conditions, the diagnosis that's made, the reason why the service was provided, that the service was provided, and any subsequent recommendations to the patient. All that needs to be in the clinical record, as well as when patients disclose any dental information to a team member, they need to be aware they need to capture that as well. So when a patient calls into the front desk, they give a chief complaint. That chief complaint should be captured in a way that that is conveyed and communicated to the clinical staffs. As far as the hygienists, the assistants, there are a lot of things that they need to capture in the process in that clinical record to make sure that all those touch points with the patients are documented in a way that it's not lost. Patients don't always remember the same conversations we do. They don't remember that they were told a particular thing. And unless we capture that interaction in the clinical record, for all intents and purposes, and from the legal standpoint, that conversation never happened. So there are things that are done and said that we need to be aware of that are in that clinical record to establish what was done and why it was done. And that's going to testify you in the event that you go to court. It will also protect you in the event that there's a board complaint. There are standards that are established with that clinical record that we need to meet. So if a patient makes a complaint to the board about a clinical issue, and in the instances that I've been involved, there's no issue with the clinical treatment that was provided that patient, but their clinical record didn't meet standard, that doctor got a ding from the board and remediation was ordered as a result of their clinical record. So number one, it's going to help to establish why you did it, what was done, so it will support you. If you're challenged, it also gives that billing person the information they need to be able to submit a complete claim, charging for all those things that were performed that we are entitled to. And it also helps protect in the event that there's a malpractice claim or some other action against you. So it's very important that we capture that for multiple reasons.
Yep. Well, and this is kind of I don't know, from a question perspective to ask, why do people not document? And I'm sure in many cases you hear, we were too busy. Once we got down that path, it was hard to go back and do that. It seems though, Roy, like with a lot of the newer technologies and a lot more practices becoming efficient, that there are some easier ways certainly to make sure that you build that into your daily rhythm, right? So that
absolutely
it doesn't happen. But I'm sure you hear that a lot.
It's all a matter of putting it in the system. You know, you get complaints, well, does it make any difference? Does it matter? Or it takes too much time? Or, you know, I want to focus on my treatment of my patients. Certainly all those are arguments that can be made. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you have a system in place and everybody understands their responsibility and there are templates, and I'm not a big proponent of having huge templates, but have them so that it's easy to capture the information in a very organic way. So it's not something that you have to go out of your way or that you have to postpone. It's just a matter of, just like doing a composite restoration, it's step by step by step. Same thing with your clinical. You know, you don't say, I'm not going to do this restoration this way because it's too complicated. You do it because it's the right thing, and there are steps that you need to go through. And if everybody, well, number one, they're established, and number two, everybody understands their position in that process, it happens organically. It's just, you do it without even thinking. It's just part of the process. And it's a matter of building that into the daily routine in a way that everybody knows the system, works the system, and you really don't have to think about it that much.
Right. And I was just sitting here actually doing a little bit of math in my head, and I don't know the average number of patients that a practice sees in a day, but I'm just going to say it's 15. So let's say in a given month, a practice sees a minimal amount of 300 patients. That's just 1 month. And I think to myself, every patient is different. Every scenario is different. And based on your, conversation about documentation and all of that, I can just imagine, where things could slip and where those holes could be. So, yeah, I mean, it's massive. It's really when you really step back and think about it, as you have experienced.
Sure. And, if you look at it, it's the whole patient contact should be systemized. So, although it sounds like it's a huge amount, but it doesn't take that much time. Like I said, if you put it in place, actually, if you have the system in place, it takes a lot less time than if you just do it from the seat of your pants. And if you have enough time, I'm going to go ahead and enter this information. without, and, you know, I'll be talking about their responsibilities. A lot of doctors say, I don't have enough time to do that. I know you don't. You shouldn't do it. You're not the one that's in the team that's going to be focusing on that. It's a matter of that person who understands what needs to be captured. And doctor, your point is to read it and to make any modifications at the end. And that being the case, it doesn't take that much time. It's a matter of bringing the team on board, just like teaching them how to assist with a crown prep, teaching them how to capture the information and the experience during that that interaction with the patient. They understand I need to capture this, this, and this. And most of the time they can just listen to the conversation between the doctor and the patient, and they understand what happened and are able to make a notation of that. And if your templates are such that they're flexible, but they're complete, it's an easy way to do that. It's just a matter of click, 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 and enter a little bit of information, and you're done. It's not a matter of starting at the beginning and writing the whole great American novel.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So I know that we could probably talk about this next question for like 3 days, billing and coding. And we'll get into maybe a little bit more detail, but why is that so important when in this whole process?
That dental claim that you send in to the insurance carrier representing what you did for that patient needs to be accurate in all its aspects. It's a legal document. And if you send that in with inaccurate information, that claim could be considered fraudulent if it's not completely accurate. And there are codes in the code set to use that best describes the service that you provide. Ultimately, that's your responsibility as a team to be able to use the code that best describes that service that you provided, nothing more and nothing less. If you use a code, for example, you have done a crown and it's all porcelain, but the claim is sent in for whatever reason with an incorrect code, with porcelain fused to high noble metal. That misrepresents what was provided for that patient in a way that it may result in a higher reimbursement. That act would be considered fraudulent. You've misrepresented the service that you have provided in a way that would result in a higher reimbursement than you're entitled to. So each service should be codified in a way that it's most accurately represented. Doing other than that, that claim could be considered fraudulent because you used an inappropriate claim. And in today's world, well, one of the things I didn't understand was the legal definition of intent to defraud. And I knew it meant that if you submitted a claim for a service you never did on a patient you never saw, that would be completely wrong. But the legal definition is much broader. It includes what's considered blind disregard, which means if you do the same thing the same way, making the same or similar mistake without having a system to identify and correct those mistakes, that from a legal standpoint is considered blind disregard. So there's no such thing as an innocent mistake. If you receive government reimbursement of any kind, that would be if you see Medicare, Medicaid, if you see patients who are dependents of active duty military, if you see federal employees, if you see anybody that's insured under the Affordable Health Care Act, all those are reimbursed to some extent by government funds. And there is a mandated 7-step compliance program associated with those programs that you need to have in your practice. And when I'm speaking, I'll have them raise their hand. How many of you see patients that are reimbursed in one of these ways? And almost everybody will raise their hand. And I said, I'll ask the second question. How many of you have a 7-step compliance program in your practice? And I've been doing it for a number of years in a lot of locations, probably thousands and thousands of individuals from practices. And I had one gentleman raise his hand that said, yes, they have adopted that 7-step compliance program in their practice. And I was kind of startled. I said, can you tell me how you came about learning that you needed that? He said he actually had an action against him from one of the entities, and he learned that way that he needed the 7-step compliance program. If you have that in place, it's no longer blind disregard. You're doing what's considered reasonable to discover and correct those mistakes. Yeah. One of the things I thought, if I got anything I wasn't entitled to, I could return it with any interest and penalties that may be associated with. Best offer I ever got to settle was 3 years in prison and a restitution of $600,000. So I wasn't allowed to give it back. My point was that if I've got anything I wasn't entitled to, I'd gladly give it back. I don't want anything I don't deserve. Sure. Never given that option. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, I think that takes the work that you're doing and this topic to a whole nother level. That blind disregard is because I would have to think, Roy, that when these cases are looked at, where do you draw the line to know that somebody is doing something on purpose or in an effort to try to get away with it, or literally hasn't taken the time to understand what that implication is? Either way, the result is the same, right? Which is that. So,
and to give you an idea of the depth, the evaluation that they did, the investigation was for a 6-year period, and over the 6-year period, I was paid $3.5 million for the services I provided, which is a huge number, $3.5 million. Of the $3.5 million that I was paid, the amount that they determined I got that I wasn't entitled to was $17,899.57. That's 0.01% of the amount that I had submitted. And I thought that was a pretty good error percentage. Right. And although we were to go back through that 3-year period and do an evaluation, there was work that I did, should have billed for, could have been billed for and paid for. Excuse me, we just didn't. In excess of that amount, it made no difference.
Right.
So actually, in the big scheme of things, they actually owed me money. Made no difference at all.
Right.
So that's the world we live in. It's just a matter of making an example, and I guess I was the example. They wanted to send a message to dentistry, and I'm literally carrying it to dentistry. But I want giving them the tools that they need to meet the requirements and not be in the same hot water.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, again, as I have spoke with people in the industry, there is certainly a large amount of respect for you and the work that you're doing and what you've gone through. And this is important stuff. And I know what we're going to do here is we're going to wrap this video podcast. Now, you and I are going to go and do our audio podcast, which all of you will be able to listen on DentalCast Productions, a little bit more about Roy's story. We're also going to talk a little bit about how to stay out of prison, although as he's kind of laid this out, and I think that there certainly are some key points there for you to hone in on how you would prevent yourself from doing that. And, want to give a shout out to Robin Morrison from Dental Consultant Connection, and let all you know that she's put together this great team of individuals. Certainly Dr. Roy Shelburne is one of them. And I'm going to go ahead and put up on the screen, if you want to learn more about Dr. Roy and how he can help, whether it be speaking or help you in your practice or any of the great work that he does. We've got the phone number up on the screen. He's got his own page there on the Dental Consultant Connection website where you can learn more about him, connect with him and all of that. So, Dr. Roy, this has been a pleasure. I've heard a lot about you, and certainly to have the opportunity to speak with you is wonderful. And I look forward to the audio.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thanks very much. Thanks, Robin. Good to see you.
All right. Talk soon.
Yeah.